Join me as I read Tim Lomas's 2023 paper, The Ultraterrestrial Hypothesis, the second of 3 bonus episode readings of academic papers that highlight the possibility of an ancient breakaway civilization hiding somewhere in our midst. Hello everyone and welcome to UAP as NHI. I'm your host Bill Seago, and today I'm offering an audio rendition of Tim Lomas's November 2023 paper that appeared in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology titled The Ultraterrestrial Hypothesis, a case for scientific openness to an interdimensional explanation for UAP. Like the last paper I covered, I was surprised to find no audio version offered. This is the second of 3 readings of academic papers on the topic, with the final coming in the next week or 2 that will appear ahead of my official episode on the topic. Dr. Lomas explores the possibility that some UAP may originate from dimensions beyond our conventional understanding of space and time. Dr. Lomas produces his own interpretation of the ultraterrestrial hypothesis, suggesting that certain UAP could be manifestations of entities from parallel dimensions or realities coexisting with our own. This perspective challenges the traditional extraterrestrial hypothesis, which posits that UAP are spacecraft from other planets. The paper emphasizes the need for scientific openness and epistemic humility when investigating UAP. Dr. Lomas argues that the persistent and unexplained nature of some UAP incidents warrants consideration of unconventional explanations, including interdimensional origins. He draws parallels between contemporary UAP reports and historical accounts of anomalous phenomena, suggesting a continuity that transcends cultural and temporal boundaries. It must be noted that Dr. Lomas does not make a clear distinction between the interdimensional hypothesis and ultraterrestrial hypothesis, with strict regard to origin. This is likely the result of a convolution of newer terms and ideas surrounding the topic, so a distinction must be made here as a disclaimer. The interdimensional hypothesis claims that the origin of these craft and intelligences are from a pre-existing or extra-dimensional realm, while the ultraterrestrial hypothesis proposes they actually originate from Earth as a breakaway civilization or separate species that now reside in or sometimes hide within a higher dimension. Basically, they are 2 distinct points of origin that are sometimes overlooked or misinterpreted, with ultraterrestrial being more related to cryptoterrestrial. The distinctions are ever evolving and claims relatively new, especially considering academic papers on the topic have only recently emerged over the past few years. Revisions may be forthcoming as new ideas and further details on the terms emerge. About the author. Dr. Tim Lomas is a psychology research scientist affiliated with the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University. His academic work traditionally centers on well-being, positive psychology, and cross-cultural studies. In recent years, however, Dr. Lomas has expanded his research interests to include the scientific exploration of UAP. Following the paper read in this episode, Lomas co-authored The Cryptoterrestrial Hypothesis, a case for scientific openness to a concealed earthly explanation for unidentified anomalous phenomena the following year. This paper will be the next reading on the topic and explores the possibility that UAP may be linked to intelligent beings concealed on Earth or its near environs, further emphasizing the need for epistemic humility and scientific investigations of such phenomena. The PDF of this paper, which includes citations throughout as well as toward the end of the document, can be found at researchgate.net. A link will be provided in the description. So without further ado, I present the Ultraterrestrial Hypothesis. A Case for Scientific Openness to an Interdimensional Explanation for UAP. Tim Lomas, Ph.D., Cambridge, Massachusetts. Abstract. Recent years have seen increasing public attention regarding unidentified anomalous phenomena. Hypotheses for such phenomena tend to fall into two classes: a conventional terrestrial explanation, for example, human-made drones, or an extraterrestrial explanation, i.e., advanced civilizations from elsewhere in the cosmos. However, there is also a third minority class of hypothesis, an unconventional terrestrial explanation outside the prevailing consensus view of life in the universe. This is the Ultraterrestrial Hypothesis, which includes, but is not limited to, the Interdimensional Hypothesis, namely the highly speculative notion that UAP may reflect activities of beings from other dimensions that coexist alongside our own. Such hypotheses may rightly be regarded with skepticism by most scientists. However, this paper suggests they nevertheless should not be ruled out, and deserve serious consideration in a spirit of epistemic humility and openness. Keywords: philosophy, science, extraterrestrial, ultraterrestrial, non-human intelligence. An empirical mystery. This article begins with an empirical mystery. For decades, and indeed centuries, people worldwide have reported seeing phenomena in the sky that appeared anomalous in some way. Essentially, these did not seem to conform with the expected behavior of celestial objects or processes people were familiar with, whether naturally occurring, for example planets, or human-made, for example airplanes, and appeared to defy, to the observer at least, conventional scientific knowledge. These have attracted the label Unidentified Flying Object, UFO, and more recently Unidentified Aerial Phenomena, UAP, with the latter expanding even further in scope over the past few years to denote unidentified anomalous phenomena, reflecting a realization that some UAP appear to have transmedium capabilities, including traveling underwater, and are not only just aerial. However, just what constitutes conventional scientific opinion begs the question central to this paper. What makes knowledge conventional? How accurate is it? And what kinds of findings might encourage its revision? These questions shall be explored below, but for now, let us grant that, at least until recently, the conventional scientific consensus held that humans are alone in the universe, the Earth a solitary outpost of sentience, indeed of life in general. With this view, there are only two recognized classes of celestial phenomena: naturally occurring material bodies, for example planets, or processes, for example atmospheric occasions, or human inventions, for example airplanes, and productions, for example gas emissions. In that context, unidentified indicates a phenomenon cannot be conclusively situated within either category. A key consideration in that respect is the implicit question, by whom? The article delves into this issue below, but for now, let us differentiate authorities, including scientific, military, and political personnel, and the public, i.e., everyone else. The former are usually granted more credibility, not least since their bar for ascertaining phenomena as unidentified is far higher, given their privileged access to relevant information, technology, and learning, than the public. Until recently, most UAP reports hailed from the public. Indeed, there are vast quantities, with the Mutual UFO Network reportedly receiving over 200,000 since its founding in 1969. However, on the whole, these have not been taken seriously by the academic community, with some exceptions. The question of whether other authorities have taken them seriously is a matter of dispute, with allegations of secretive government and military programs investigating the phenomenon, discussed further below. At the very least, authorities have generally maintained a lack of interest publicly. In that respect, reports of UAP by the public have tended to be dismissed, usually attributed to perceptual or cognitive error. In some cases, this means doubting the phenomena a person ostensibly witnessed occurred at all, with explanations including hallucination, delusion, and fraud. In other cases, the visual experience per se may be granted, but the interpretation is chalked up as errant, a misperception or misunderstanding. The phenomenon may be unidentified for that observer, but would not be for others with the requisite technology or knowledge, who could debunk their assessment as merely a prosaic airborne event, like a weather balloon. However, more recently, over the past 2 decades especially, reports have begun accumulating that resist such debunking. Crucially, many are not from the public, but the authorities themselves, which makes the reports more credible for many reasons. For a start, they involve observers who have excelled in occupations that require the highest skill and training in visual perception and processing, such as fighter pilots, meaning they are regarded as higher quality witnesses than the average observer. Moreover, their testimony is often triangulated with other evidence, including relatively high-quality photographs or video and other information sources, for example, radar. As a result of these accumulating observations, in 2020, the U.S. military established a UAP task force charged with investigating these occurrences, which has subsequently produced various reports and analyses. However, I should emphasize that the news around this topic is developing fast, and this article, which went to press in early August 2023, is likely to be swiftly overtaken by forthcoming events and assessments. For example, in June 2023, public whistleblowing allegations were made by David Grush, a veteran of the intelligence community, that the U.S. actually has non-human UAP craft and entities in its possession. While the veracity of these claims is not publicly known at present, they seem to have at least been received as credible and moreover have apparently been corroborated by others. Additionally, they have apparently prompted various significant developments, including new legislation, most strikingly bipartisan proposals in July from Chuck Schumer, Majority Leader of the United States Senate, for an Unidentified Anomalous Phenomena Disclosure Act. As reported in the New York Times, this is intended to create a commission with broad authority to declassify government documents about UFOs and extraterrestrial matters, in an attempt to force the government to share all that it knows about unidentified phenomena. As Schumer wrote, the American public has a right to learn about technologies of unknown origins, non-human intelligence, and unexplainable phenomena. Moreover, the Act gives authorities a 300-day deadline to organize their records and provide them to the review board. Other consequential developments include congressional hearings, including one by the House Oversight Committee on July 26, which committee member Representative Tim Burchett announced on Twitter, accompanied by the statement, "We're done with the cover-ups," at which Grush and 2 Navy pilots testified under oath, making numerous extraordinary allegations that the committee members seemed determined to investigate and act upon. As such, there are likely to be significant new developments on this topic going forward, and readers are encouraged to follow the latest updates from key figures. In terms of current information, though, the most recent data release, at the time of writing, from the UAP Task Force came in May 2023, when NASA convened a televised panel to discuss the efforts of their own UAP task force, formed in October 2022. Presenting at the event was Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, see Sean Kirkpatrick May 31 presentation, Director of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, AARO. Launched in November 2021 by the Defense Department as successor to the original military task force, initially as the Airborne Object Identification and Management Group, and renamed in July 2022, AARO has a remit to, among other things, identify unidentified anomalous phenomena that might pose a threat to national security and the operations of the military and federal agencies. Answering questions, he revealed the current number of anomalous sightings of which AARO was aware was around 800, though he speculated the majority most likely did have conventional explanations, and currently remained unidentified only through lack of good data that would allow conclusive identification. However, around 2 to 5% of the 800, perhaps between 15 and 40 occurrences, were genuinely, possibly really anomalous. Intriguingly, most involved small spherical orbs, often between 3 and 13 feet, usually described as either white, silver, metallic, or translucent, with the latter frequently featuring a dark cube inside. Despite lacking wings, apparent forms of propulsion, or any thermal exhaust, these strange orbs are seemingly capable of unusual maneuvers and flying at velocities up to twice the speed of sound. Moreover, investigative journalist Ross Coulthart, 2023, who is intimately connected to the UAP topic and has conducted numerous interviews with key players, as cited below, suggested these are frequently reported as being apparently under intelligent control, including intelligently moving around aircraft. Essentially, for the authorities, with all their knowledge, data, and technology, such phenomena are not only currently unidentified, but also seem genuinely anomalous, as opposed to simply lacking the data to permit conclusive identification as conventional. These phenomena therefore constitute a real empirical mystery, one which science is surely obligated to investigate, as indeed is already happening. In that regard, scholars are also beginning to formulate hypotheses about what UAP may represent. There are two main classes of explanation: a conventional terrestrial origin, for example, human-made drones, and more radically, an unconventional extraterrestrial origin, i.e., advanced civilizations from elsewhere in the cosmos. Indeed, the latter interpretation was discussed in two recently published papers by the author, which provided the genesis for the present article. However, I had become increasingly aware that many scientists closest to the topic, including people on the UAP task force, were not only considering an extraterrestrial explanation, but had become compelled to contemplate an even more radical third class of explanation, an unconventional terrestrial origin, one outside the prevailing consensus view of the universe. This is the Ultraterrestrial Hypothesis, a broad category of conjecture that includes the Interdimensional Hypothesis, namely the highly speculative notion that UAP may involve activities of beings from other dimensions that coexist alongside our own. Hence, ultraterrestrial. Such beings may already be present in the Earth's environment in some sense, just not in ways we can conventionally understand. One should note that these two hypotheses are not identical, but rather constitute an overlapping Venn diagram. On one hand, an entity could be interdimensional without being ultraterrestrial, instead perhaps materializing from this other dimension somewhere in the universe other than Earth. Conversely, an entity could be ultraterrestrial without being interdimensional. To that point, other ultraterrestrial hypotheses have been proposed, as per a recent taxonomy proffered by Puthoff, 2022, including extradimensional, i.e. interdimensional, cryptoterrestrial, demonic and/or jinn, proto and/or ancient human, and time travelers. He defines these broadly as sequestered terrestrial cultures existing alongside us in distinct stealth. For instance, cryptoterrestrials implies that, rather than hailing from other dimensions, the entities responsible for UAP activity instead reside on Earth in a relatively more conventional sense, i.e. with standard space-time dimensions, but are nevertheless hidden in some way, for example, living underground. I recognize, of course, that many scientists would simply dismiss the notion of an interdimensional hypothesis, and likewise ultraterrestrial hypotheses more broadly, out of hand. Indeed, many of the UAP experts who began broaching these possibilities themselves seemed highly skeptical and wary of even considering these, being aware how far outside the boundaries of conventional scientific understanding and discourse such ideas are. However, they have become compelled by the sheer peculiarities of the empirical data, by what has been called the high strangeness of many UAP occurrences, to put these kinds of hypotheses on the table. Consider Gary Nolan, an immunologist with an endowed chair at Stanford who has for the past decade been involved in UAP research, including analyzing anomalous materials potentially linked to recovered UAP. In a recent interview with Nolan, Ross Coulthart asked, "You believe on the evidence that there is a non-human intelligence of advanced technology on this planet?" Nolan replied, "Advanced capabilities. No, I don't know whether it's a technology per se, because I'm leaving open the idea that it's some form of consciousness that is non-material. And I know, say to my colleagues out there, this sounds absolutely crazy. But if you've seen the things that I've seen, you would only be able to come to a similar conclusion." In the same spirit, this article argues for tentatively keeping at least an open mind to possibilities that may be interdimensional, no matter how unlikely they may appear. There was no way of seriously entertaining this hypothesis in the aforementioned published papers, other than briefly introducing it. Such is its nature. An entire paper is needed to even consider it, and even then it is impossible to do justice to the relevant perspectives and issues within standard word limits, despite being generously allowed to exceed these. Nevertheless, it is important to make the attempt. As such, this article makes the case for scientific openness to this hypothesis over 7 sections. Following the present introductory ground setting, it proceeds by considering the current state of publicly available UAP assessment, knowledge, and hypothesizing. From there, I turn to the ultraterrestrial hypothesis and suggest openness to this is warranted based on the sheer strangeness of A, UAP activity, B, the universe, and C, consciousness. The article concludes with a general plea for epistemic humility and openness. UAP assessment. Over recent decades, numerous UAP events have received intense scrutiny. Arguably, the most intriguing and well-studied recent occurrence is a series of encounters in November 2004 involving the U.S. Navy's Carrier Strike Group 11, particularly the USS Nimitz nuclear aircraft carrier, which have been subjected to detailed analysis. Essentially, situated off the California coast, over a 2-week period, the group encountered as many as 100 UAP. This culminated in a dramatic sequence of interactions on November 14, 2004, which began when 2 FA-18F Super Hornets on a training exercise engaged at close quarters a white airborne UAP, shaped like a cylindrical butane tank, or a Tic Tac, moving erratically back and forth, involving instantaneous changes in direction without changing speed, despite lacking apparent flight surfaces or means of propulsion, which eventually suddenly accelerated as if shot out of a rifle and was out of sight in a split second. Subsequently, FA-18Fs with infrared recording technologies went to investigate and managed to film a UAP, albeit from a considerable distance, a segment of which was released to the public in 2017. Analyzing the available data, Knuth and others suggest the extreme estimated flight characteristics of the objects mean there are 2 main explanations. Either their observations are fabricated or seriously in error, or alternatively, these craft exhibit technology far more advanced than any known craft on Earth. Some committed skeptics, convinced a priori there must be conventional explanations, have been determined to prove the first option. However, such explanations require one to entirely discount the eyewitness testimony of the experienced aviators, all of whom report observing something highly anomalous. As pilot Chad Underwood, who took the infrared video, said, "It was just behaving in ways that aren't physically normal. That's what caught my eye. Because aircraft, whether they're manned or unmanned, still have to obey the laws of physics. They have to have some source of lift, some source of propulsion. The Tic Tac was not doing that. It was going from like 50,000 feet to, 100 feet in like seconds, which is not possible." In part due to such testimony, Knuth and others concluded The number and quality of eyewitnesses, the variety of roles they played in the encounters, and the equipment used to track and record the craft favor the latter hypothesis that these are technologically advanced craft. Due to such incidents, the UAP question has commanded increasing attention from authorities in the past few years, certainly publicly at least. Private interest may be another matter. Over the past 75 years have been reports of various secretive programs run by the U.S. government, among others, to investigate UAP. However, still very little has been publicly released or known about them, and the official government position was generally one of denial. This situation began to change, though, in December 2017 when the Nimitz video was obtained and published online, along with U.S. military footage of two similar incidents, which began to bring the topic to wider attention, especially following an article in the New York Times entitled "Glowing Auras and Black Money, the Pentagon's Mysterious UFO Program." At that point, the government was still not commenting publicly on the issue. But in April 2020, the Department of Defense confirmed the footage was genuine, prompting a New York Times article in July 2020. No longer in shadows, Pentagon's UFO unit will make some findings public. The next month, the U.S. announced it was establishing its UAP task force, charged with investigating these incidents. As noted above, at its most recent public update in May 2023, Dr. Kirkpatrick stated the number of sightings was now around 800, and while most probably did have conventional explanations, around 2 to 5% were genuinely, possibly really anomalous. Indeed, while much of the work of the task force and now AARO is still classified, comments from key figures indicate the possibility of some UAP being truly extraordinary, for example, extraterrestrial, is being taken seriously. Barack Obama, for example, said, "There's footage and records of objects in the skies that we don't know exactly what they are. We can't explain how they moved, their trajectory. They did not have an easily explainable pattern." Indeed, despite the efforts over the past few years to investigate such phenomena, such as through the UAP task force, some are still perplexing authorities. Speaking about the issue in early August 2023, for instance, General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the U.S.'s highest-ranking military officer and the principal military advisor to the president, said that the military can explain a lot of it, i.e. UAP, but there is some that's really kind of weird and unexplainable. Moreover, the authorities clearly regard such phenomena as a potential source of concern and even threat. John Ratcliffe, former director of national intelligence, said, "We are talking about objects that have been seen by Navy or Air Force pilots, or have been picked up by satellite imagery, that frankly engage in actions that are difficult to explain, movements that are hard to replicate, that we don't have the technology for." He also warned, "Frankly, we are not capable of defending against these technologies." Regarding the latter point, it is worth emphasizing the intention behind the creation of AARO in November 2021, within the new National Defense Authorization Act as successor to the original task force, namely to synchronize efforts across the department and the broader U.S. government to detect, identify, and attribute objects of interests in special use to aerospace, SUA, and to assess and mitigate any associated threats to safety of flight and national security. The importance of this task was illustrated in a hearing in Congress on May 17, 2022, which Representative Andre Carson opened and contextualized by stating, "This hearing and oversight work has a simple idea at its core. Unidentified aerial phenomena are a potential national security threat, and they need to be treated that way. For too long, the stigma associated with UAP has gotten in the way of good intelligence analysis. Pilots avoided reported or laughed at when they did. DoD officials relegated the issue to the back room or swept it under the rug, entirely fearful of a skeptical national security community. Today, we know better UAP are unexplained. It's true, but they are real. They need to be investigated, and many threats they pose need to be mitigated." Later fielding questions, Scott W. Bray, Deputy Director of U.S. Naval Intelligence, added, "I would simply say that there are a number of other events in which we do not have an explanation, in which there are a small handful in which there are flight characteristics or signature management that we can't explain with the data that we have." So the vital question then is, what are these UAP? In the Senate hearing, Bray would not speculate, but noted they are open to all hypotheses, and that we'll go wherever the data takes us. This is the spirit of scientific inquiry. As discussed below, the history of science is characterized by discoveries of phenomena that cannot be accommodated within the conventional scientific paradigm. At that point, there are two main options: to dismiss the data, for example, as errant, or to consider explanations outside this paradigm, and hence to update or even overturn it. With UAP, the general paradigmatic assumption until recently has been that humans are alone in the cosmos, or at least even if extraterrestrial life per se is granted as a statistical probability, the chance of such entities actually reaching Earth is considered exceedingly unlikely. From that perspective, the baseline presumption would be that UAP involve either natural phenomena or human-made inventions. However, such are the data that authorities are essentially being compelled to consider other possibilities, namely that some UAP may represent the activity of intelligent life besides humans. Former CIA Director John Brennan, for example, called it presumptuous and arrogant for us to believe that there's no other form of life anywhere in the entire universe, adding cryptically, "I think some of the phenomena we're going to be seeing continues to be unexplained and might, in fact, be some type of phenomenon that is the result of something that we don't yet understand, and that could involve some type of activity that some might say constitutes a different form of life." These remarks are profound and indicate at least an openness to two striking possibilities. The first is that UAP represent activities of extraterrestrial beings, i.e., life forms from elsewhere in the universe. The second is the even more radical notion that they may represent ultraterrestrial beings, i.e., life forms already present in our Earth environment in some form. Before focusing on the latter, we should acknowledge that the extraterrestrial hypothesis is certainly plausible. However, intriguingly, authorities also appear open, perhaps even increasingly so, to an ultraterrestrial hypothesis. It is notable, for example, that the new UAP Disclosure Act does not include extraterrestrial, but rather repeatedly, 22 times, refers ambiguously to non-human intelligence, which it defines as any sentient, intelligent, non-human life form, regardless of nature or ultimate origin, that may be presumed responsible for unidentified anomalous phenomena, or of which the federal government has become aware. Indeed, multiple hypotheses could be correct. The phenomenon may be multifaceted, involving numerous extraterrestrial and/or ultraterrestrial entities. Thus, establishing the ultraterrestrial hypothesis as valid would not necessarily negate an extraterrestrial explanation, and vice versa. With that in mind, I turn to the hypothesis at the heart of this article. Ultraterrestrial hypotheses. To repeat, in the theorizing surrounding UAP, while most thinking involves two main classes of explanation, a conventional terrestrial origin or an unconventional extraterrestrial one, there is also a third class, an unconventional terrestrial origin. This is sometimes called the ultraterrestrial hypothesis, an overarching category which includes the interdimensional hypothesis, our focus here. This hypothesis is the highly speculative notion that UAP may reflect activities of beings from dimensions that coexist alongside the four dimensions of space-time we humans usually perceive, i.e., three physical dimensions plus time. Hence, ultraterrestrial. Such beings are already present in Earth's environment in some sense, just not in ways we can conventionally understand. Before looking into the interdimensional hypothesis, I should reiterate that this is not the only ultraterrestrial hypothesis, with Puthoff 2022 elucidating other possibilities, including extradimensional, i.e. interdimensional, cryptoterrestrial, demonic and or jinn, proto and or ancient human, and time travelers. While such hypotheses may sound very far-fetched, in the spirit of this article I would concur with Puthoff that they should not be a priori dismissed as impossible. Indeed, some observers closely connected to the UAP topic are also beginning to genuinely entertain these. In terms of the interdimensional hypothesis specifically, among its earliest modern proponents was ufologist Meade Lane, 1950, who argued that UAP were piloted by beings from a parallel dimension he called Etheria, whose ether ships were usually invisible but could be seen when their atomic motion became slow enough. The notion was then developed by Jacques Vallée and John Keel, the latter coining ultraterrestrials in 1970 to denote such beings, describing them as entities who are potentially composed of energy, inhabiting a spectrum, wavelength, of energy which we can neither observe or even presently detect. Or, as Vallée, 2008, put it, I believe the UFO phenomenon represents evidence for other dimensions beyond space-time. The UFOs may not come from ordinary space, but from a multiverse which is all around us, and of which we have stubbornly refused to consider the disturbing reality in spite of the evidence available to us for centuries. Vallée also saw this notion as being a conceptual continuum between modern UAP sightings and experiences in past generations interpreted as spiritual beings, for example, angels. For instance, he discusses the famous sightings in Fatima, Portugal in 1917, the final one of which was witnessed by up to 70,000 people. While interpreted by many as a religious visitation, it was described in terms that recall modern UAP accounts. For example, reports of a weird disk that turns rapidly on its own axis and casts a beam of colored lights in all directions. I acknowledge that the notion of ultraterrestrial and or interdimensional beings is very far-fetched to modern science. However, I would nevertheless argue that this hypothesis should not yet be definitively ruled out. Indeed, many UAP analysts allude to such possibilities, even if they do not use ultraterrestrial per se, as reflected in Gary Nolan's quote above. This openness was articulated by Senator Harry Reid, a driving force behind efforts towards greater attention and openness to UAP among U.S. authorities, in a foreword to a book by Lakatsky and others, 2021, recounting a recent program to investigate UAP funded by the Defense Intelligence Agency, discussed below. The UAP Task Force report proves what I have been saying all along. This is a matter of science, national security, and technological advancement. From whatever hypothesis you begin with, UAP being technological leaps from foreign adversaries, natural occurrences distorting visual perception, visitations from other dimensions, or technology from otherworldly sources, the key point is we need to engage the best minds in science to explore the data we know exists. As the portion in italics shows, the idea of interdimensional ultraterrestrials is a genuine hypothesis that deserves, indeed is receiving, at least in some quarters, real consideration. Take, for example, reactions to whistleblower David Grush's explosive allegations, introduced above, that U.S. authorities actually have some UAP craft and non-human entities in their possession as part of a crash retrieval program. As noted above, although there is no way of knowing the validity of these allegations at the time of writing, they seem to have spurred various consequential developments, including legislative proposals seemingly designed to address Grush's concerns. Of particular interest here are speculations regarding the possible nature of any such craft, with Grush claiming these are of exotic origin, non-human intelligence, whether extraterrestrial or unknown origin. Elaborating on this point, interviewed by Ross Coulthart, aired on News Nation on June 11, when asked if the U.S. government had been concealing the existence on this planet of alien life, Grush pointedly clarified, in a way reminiscent of Gary Nolan's response to a similar question from Coulthart above. I would couch it as non-human intelligence because I don't necessarily want to denote origin. I don't think we have all the data to say, oh, they're coming from a certain location, and I couch it as someone who studied physics, that maybe they're coming from another physical dimension, as described in quantum mechanics. There is a possibility that this is not necessarily extraterrestrial, and it's coming from a higher dimensional physical space that might be co-located right here. We know there's extra dimensions due to high energy particle collisions, etc., and there's a theoretical framework to explain that. Indeed, one of the legislative endeavors alluded to above are amendments to the forthcoming Intelligence Authorization Act, which requires anyone with knowledge of crash retrieval programs to make available to AARO for assessment, analysis, and inspection within 180 days, a comprehensive list of all non-Earth origin or exotic unidentified anomalous phenomena material. So even if Grush's allegations ultimately prove unfounded, nevertheless it is notable that extraterrestrial, non-Earth origin, explanations are not the only hypotheses being touted within the intelligence community for potentially exotic crafts, hence the OR, and that another possibility is an interdimensional explanation. Openness among authorities to this seems related to one of four main interlinked reasons. The first three concern the sheer strangeness of the A, phenomena observed, B, universe, and C, consciousness. The final one involves a more general awareness, unconnected to UAP per se, about the limits of human perception and the need for epistemic humility in science. The remainder of the article addresses these in turn. The strangeness of the phenomena. Consideration of the ultraterrestrial/interdimensional hypothesis begins with the sheer high strangeness of UAP activity itself, which can be so anomalous that it sometimes attracts the label paranormal, i.e. outside or beyond what is usually considered normal. The starting point for turning to labels like high strangeness and paranormal is people essentially struggling to make sense of the phenomenon within conventional frames of reference. Recall the quote above from Pilot Underwood, who said of the Tic Tac, "It was just behaving in ways that aren't physically normal. That's what caught my eye, because aircraft, whether they're manned or unmanned, still have to obey the laws of physics." In that respect, people are beginning to question whether UAP are physical craft at all, as we would understand these terms. With the extraterrestrial hypothesis, people's thinking often remains tethered to conventional understanding of physics and technology, i.e. physical objects moving through space-time, except one imagines these civilizations as exponentially farther advanced. So, a person might picture our most cutting-edge propulsion technology and conceive of it just going far quicker. However, one finds scientists wondering whether that frame is adequate, even if they recognize that abandoning it might sound outlandish. This speculation is reflected in the quote above from Gary Nolan, who said he was leaving open the idea that it's some form of consciousness that is non-material, even though he knows it sounds absolutely crazy. This kind of suggestion, invoking ideas like non-material forms of consciousness, is not uncommon among UAP researchers. At this point, discussions of UAP intersect with considerations of other phenomena that might broadly be classified as paranormal. That is, one encounters a blurry line between classical UAP reports, for example, objects in the sky, and other anomalous phenomena that are less easily categorized. Indeed, this consideration was cited by Keel, 1970, as the reason he abandoned the extraterrestrial hypothesis in 1967 when my own field investigations disclosed an astonishing overlap between psychic phenomena and UFOs. The objects and apparitions do not necessarily originate on another planet and may not even exist as permanent constructions of matter. The question of paranormal phenomena is a vast and complex topic in its own right. As such, this article limits its discussion of such phenomena in relation to UAP specifically. In that respect, though, there has been considerable attention paid to this intersection dating back to at least the 1980s, some even involving government-funded projects, where research on paranormal activities overlaps with that focusing more narrowly on flight behaviors of UAP. A pioneer in exploring this intersection is John B. Alexander, PhD, a now retired colonel in the U.S. military with above top secret clearance, i.e., sensitive compartmented information, SCI access, who since the 1980s has investigated UAP in a defense context. Across decades of research, although he did not find any traces of secretive government black programs or cover-ups on this topic, which contradicts Grush's allegations, he did accumulate voluminous evidence attesting to the reality of such phenomena, as summarized in his 2012 book, UFOs, Myths, Conspiracies, and Realities. Even more relevantly, he resisted the notion these were necessarily or only extraterrestrial in nature, and instead engaged in ideas that align with the interdimensional hypothesis. As his book concludes, in the end, it is clear the universe is far more complex than we ever imagined. We are not close to solving the enigmas posed by UFOs. Rather, we are still on the front end of defining the fundamental issues and boundaries. A more recent example of openness to the intersection of UAP and paranormal phenomena, from both a scientific and military perspective, is the Advanced Aerospace Weapons Systems Applications Program, OSAP. Funded with $22 million from the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, this ran from 2008 to 2010 and involved a company formed by businessman Robert Bigelow, Bigelow Advanced Aerospace Space Studies, run by James Lakatsky, a DIA intelligence officer. The program was based at a 500-acre property in Utah, owned at that point by Bigelow, called Skinwalker Ranch, a name derived from a Navajo legend concerning vengeful shamans, with a long history of apparent paranormal activity. Hence the title of the aforementioned book by Lakatsky and others, 2021, detailing the program, entitled Skinwalkers at the Pentagon. While the UAP Task Force and now AARO have focused more narrowly on UAP flight behavior, OSAP has intended to have as broad a scope as possible. In addition to scrutinizing the core UAP technology itself, for example, apparent crafts and their activity, equal weight was placed on researching paranormal phenomena that co-locate with UAP and to examine psychic efforts in UAP witnesses. Hence the significance of Skinwalker Ranch, upon which various extraordinary phenomena have been witnessed by scores of independent visitors to the ranch almost continuously between 1994 and 2021, including flying orbs of varying colors, otherworldly creatures, discarnate voices, poltergeist, electromagnetic anomalies, and strange portals. For instance, Lakatsky himself experienced an unusual phenomenon there. Abruptly, Lakatsky was transfixed by something. An unearthly technological device had suddenly and silently appeared out of nowhere in the adjacent kitchen. It looked to be a complex, semi-opaque, yellowish, tubular structure. Lakatsky said nothing, but stared at the object. He looked away, looked back, and there it still was. It remained visible to Lakatsky for no more than 30 seconds before vanishing on the spot. The book contains many such examples that might be called paranormal. The essential point here, though, is not the paranormal activity per se, but that this is intertwined with phenomena classed as UAP. There are numerous accounts of orbs, for example, which is especially significant given the statement by Dr. Kirkpatrick that the majority of possibly really anomalous reports studied by AARO involve such phenomena. Essentially, OSAP identified an intimate connection between UAP and so-called paranormal activity. As Lakatsky puts it, people say, well, we're only going to look at the nuts and bolts machines. Well, you better come up with a lot of physics. It's far more advanced than we're capable of now. And then there's others who say, well, they're nothing more than ghosts. part of the paranormal world? No, they're a hybrid of both. Similarly, UAP scholar Jeffrey Kripal said, "The difficult truth is that the UFO phenomenon has both an objective hard aspect, think fighter jet videos, photographs, alleged metamaterials, apparent advanced propulsion methods, and landing marks, and a subjective human aspect, think close encounters, multiple and coordinated visual sightings, altered states of consciousness, visionary displays, often of a most baroque or sci-fi sort, and experienced traumatic or transcendent abductions. And both sides, both the material and the mental dimensions, are incredibly important to get a sense of the full picture," cited in Lakatsky and others, who further note that OSAP was determined to capture both. In that respect, OSAP followed a 6-layer model developed by Valet and Davis, 2004, that encapsulates all of the potential characteristics of UAP events that can be studied. A, the physical layer, those physical characteristics associated with a UAP event. B, the anti-physical layer, the patterns that conflict with those predicted in modern physics. C, the psychological layer, the psychological impacts to the witness and the social conditions that surround them. D, the physiological layer, the effects perceived by humans. E, the psychic layer, the effects commonly found in the parapsychology literature. And F, the cultural layer, the primary and secondary effects upon society. The more conventional scientific approach to UAP, as seen with the UAP task force and associated analyses, is to focus on A above, and sometimes also B. However, the key message from endeavors like OSAP is that the other 4 layers are also integral to the phenomenon, and that ignoring and or downplaying these would hinder our understanding of it. These layers are part of the case for openness to the ultraterrestrial hypothesis. Significantly, though, so is layer B, the anti-physical layer. That is, the strangeness of the phenomena leads some observers to conclude the behavior of UAP somehow contravenes the laws of nature, as per the quote above by Pilot Underwood. That, however, of course begs the questions of what these laws actually are, and how complete our knowledge is of them. In that regard, it is possible that an ultraterrestrial/interdimensional hypothesis may not in fact run counter to these laws. A good example of such complexities again comes from Skinwalker Ranch, which, since OSAP has continued to be studied, most recently by a team featuring astrophysicist Travis Taylor, for many years involved with governmental initiatives relating to UAP, including the task force, as documented on the TV program The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch. Among the anomalies investigated is a strange area of space or air above the ranch, situated roughly between 31 and 5,000 feet. The team's attention was first drawn to this due to UAP, generally orbs, frequently appearing and disappearing suddenly in this area. Probing further, technological malfunctions often occurred there. For instance, rockets would explode or veer wildly off course, frequently at exactly 31 feet. Various scanning techniques have thus been harnessed to investigate it, including on Season 4, Episode 9, a low-frequency radio wave radar scanner carried by meteorological balloon. Strikingly, this identified huge increases in the magnetic field and simultaneous decreases in the electric field. The team were stunned, given typically we would see both fields rise and lower together. As described by Taylor, as the balloon ascended, it encountered an extreme level of magnetic energy that we have no conventional explanation for, and indeed truly defies physics. Moreover, there was a clock anomaly in the data involving a time shift of 1/4 of a second, as if there's wrinkles in space and time. Attempting to explain such strangeness, Taylor said, some scientists have suggested that these types of anomalies could be telltale signs of a traversable wormhole, i.e., a structure in space-time theorized as making it possible to take a shortcut through space. Could that explain, he wondered, why the team have apparently seen UAP ascend and simply vanish into the air? Indeed, legends of the area feature this very same notion. As Taylor put it, could we have just discovered evidence of what the indigenous people of the area have claimed for centuries, namely that interdimensional portals exist? As with other claims featured here, such as Grush's allegations, there is no way at present of confirming the veracity of such reports, let alone the validity of interpretations like interdimensional portals. Nevertheless, Taylor's remarks are germane to our discussion. On one hand, their data seemingly defy physics, at least in terms of a relatively conventional understanding of the field, for example, standard ideas of space-time. Yet on the other hand, the data can potentially be accompanied by certain boundary-pushing ideas, such as wormholes. Indeed, notions like wormholes could be placed at the intersection of the extraterrestrial and ultraterrestrial hypotheses, in that entities involved in UAP could be situated elsewhere in space, hence extraterrestrial, yet materialize on Earth as if from another dimension, hence ultraterrestrial. To that point, work at the frontiers of physics suggests that not only is UAP behavior exceedingly strange, so is the universe itself, including in ways that might even allow an interdimensional hypothesis. The strangeness of the universe. The section above suggested that UAP have aspects that appear paranormal, and possibly involve beings from other dimensions. While many people may be resistant to such extraordinary paranormal explanations, this begs the question of what is paranormal, which in turn depends on what one considers normal, and relatedly, what reality is. In that respect, it is vital one be aware of the limits of one's knowledge, and not a priori dismiss possibilities based on what may be a relatively impoverished understanding of the relevant terrain. After all, the frontiers of fields like physics are exceedingly strange. Indeed, various scientific luminaries have been credited with remarks on this theme, including J.B.S. Haldane, 1927, who wrote, "The universe is not only queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can suppose." To that point, while an interdimensional explanation may sound far-fetched, it ought to give people pause that the idea of other dimensions beyond the four of space-time we normally perceive is given serious consideration in contemporary physics. String theory, for example, one of the leading unifying field accounts of the universe, merging quantum mechanics with the general theory of relativity, posits our cosmos may have 10 dimensions. Relatedly, some accounts of string theory argue for parallel universes, with new bubble universes constantly forming and expanding indefinitely. It is beyond our scope to delve into such theories, not least because I am not a physicist, and we non-physicists must be wary of trespassing into this most rarefied of fields and using its esoteric theories as a basis for one's own arguments. Thus, that some theories in physics posit multiple dimensions by no means provides evidence for an interdimensional hypothesis. Crucially, though, I suggest it also means that physics cannot simply be used as an argument against this possibility. The key point is the need for epistemic humility, given the strangeness of the universe, and the imperative to keep an open mind, especially in areas where one is non-expert. Unfortunately, there is a widespread tendency for academics to confidently step outside their domain of expertise and make assumptions about reality, about what is normal or paranormal, based on their non-expert understanding of the relevant science. Relatedly, humans are liable to an epistemological stance of naive realism, the tendency to believe our perception of the world reflects it faithfully just as it is, unbiased and unfiltered. Significantly, this tendency also applies to scientists themselves. This is especially so with the positivist approaches that dominate much of science, which limit scientific inquiry, and at an extreme, reality itself, to what can be observed and measured. From a naive realist perspective, for example, we assume the universe is composed of solid objects. Delving into subatomic realms, however, has shown matter to be elusive and ephemeral, involving mostly empty space, together with subatomic particles that exist as a superimposition or cloud of statistical probabilities. That is, while the universe may be exceedingly strange, for most people it is not perceived in that way. It is instead likely to be appraised in an unreflecting way as conventional and commonplace, using assumptions based on the prosaic behavior of everyday objects and processes, for example, where matter really does seem solid. Such dynamics mean scholars and practitioners are often closed to possibilities that contravene their common sense view of the universe. However, it is striking that, of all scientific fields, physics seems particularly associated with views that might be deemed paranormal, as seen in the philosopher Ken Wilber's 2001 compilation, Quantum Questions, Mystical Writings of the World's Great Physicists. Consider the view expressed by Sir James Jeans, 1937, who wrote in The Mysterious Universe that the universe begins to look more like a great thought than a great machine. That said, I acknowledge not all physicists would share such views, and some might outright dismiss the possibilities in this article. If so, though, one might ask, can they really be sure that current knowledge in the field is final and total? Or, more likely, might there yet be much outside our current understanding, including not only known unknowns, phenomena scholars believe exist but do not understand, such as dark matter, but also unknown unknowns, of which people are not even aware at all. After all, the history of science means some epistemic humility is required, as considered below. Indeed, scientists have suggested that groundbreaking work at the frontiers of physics has direct relevance to the question of UAP. For instance, there has been considerable interest and speculation around the viabilities of potential breakthrough technologies that would make interstellar travel feasible, such as an Alcubierre warp drive that could allow faster-than-light travel by effectively stretching the fabric of space-time. As Lou Elizondo explains, a significant amount of mass or energy warps space-time. It's a scientific fact, not fiction. The question now is how we can manipulate this physics for technological advancement. Potentially, we could warp space-time in a way that allows us to travel from point A to point B more quickly. One purported example of research into these very possibilities is the work of Salvatore Pais, an aerospace engineer at the Naval Air Warfare Center Aircraft Division. Leaked documents disclosed by The War Zone suggested that over recent years, Pais had not only obtained numerous patents for highly advanced and esoteric forms of technology, including a space-time modification weapon, and a hybrid aerospace underwater craft that would apparently be capable of altering the fabric of space and time, but that the U.S. Navy had actually conducted experiments on some of these. Needless to say, this work remains highly secretive, though what little is publicly available is very intriguing and germane to this paper. Indeed, in Coulthart's 2021 book, In Plain Sight, An Investigation into UFOs and Impossible Science, he devotes an entire chapter to Dr. Salvatore Pais's puzzling patents. Thus, even with the secrecy surrounding it, such work suggests that research is occurring at the cutting edge of physics and other scientific fields that is not only demonstrating the strangeness of the universe, but may even be harnessing its unusual qualities in the forms of new technologies that have relevance to the question of UAP. Finally, besides the strangeness of UAP and the universe, openness to an interdimensional hypothesis also turns on the mysteries of consciousness. The strangeness of consciousness. A third pillar in the argument for openness to the interdimensional hypothesis concerns the mystery of consciousness. Recall again Nolan's response about leaving open the idea that UAP involves some form of consciousness that is non-material, even though it sounds absolutely crazy. It would seem that Nolan's concern was not misplaced, with the potential relevance of consciousness to the UAP topic often not taken seriously by authorities. As noted above, NASA 2022, for example, recently convened a 16-person team to study UAP, featuring some of the world's leading scientists, data and artificial intelligence practitioners, aerospace safety experts. Despite this breadth of expertise, they evidently did not deem it necessary to widen the scope to include scholars of consciousness. However, such experts may well have much to contribute to the discussion. Indeed, many have wrestled with the kinds of ideas raised by Nolan. Moreover, contrary to his concern, such views may well not be considered crazy by them. I noted above how non-physicists often have a relatively limited view of the field's cutting edge, leading them to dismiss possibilities that may not actually be ruled out by physicists themselves. Similar dynamics apply to consciousness studies. From an unreflective, naive realist perspective, consciousness may seem unremarkable, with subjective experience taken for granted as an unexceptional aspect of life. However, for consciousness scholars themselves, one often finds that the deeper one considers the topic, the stranger it becomes. Here we can briefly consider this strangeness with respect to issues such as A. How consciousness is thought to emerge in humans, B. Whether beings other than humans can be conscious, and C. Whether even matter itself can be conscious. If one keeps in mind Nolan's speculation, one can appreciate the relevance of these issues to the interdimensional hypothesis. The first issue is the least contentious, at least insofar as just about all scholars would concur that consciousness does indeed emerge in humans. The second issue is also now becoming less contested, with consciousness increasingly recognized as prevalent throughout the animal kingdom. This does not mean in a human sense, for example, self-conscious or aware, rather just that some form of subjective experience is there. As Nagel, 1974, put it, there is something it is like to be, a creature such as a bat, i.e. qualia of some sort, and a locus of sentiency for whom these are happening. However, the central debate is how far down to push its emergence in terms of evolutionary and neurophysiological complexity. Mammals are perhaps readily seen as conscious, but the issue is more contentious with organisms like insects. Moreover, there are disagreements about what emergence itself entails. Some argue for a distinct and discrete point in complexity at which consciousness appears, before which it is not present, such as neural activity in the thalamocortical system. However, others question whether we can indeed draw a line separating conscious from non-conscious organisms, suggesting consciousness may emerge by degrees from the very simplest forms of life, even unicellular entities. In itself, the question of consciousness in organic life forms is not directly relevant to the interdimensional hypothesis. However, this line of speculation does become particularly germane when one finds theorists wondering whether we can even locate the boundary of consciousness at life itself, and asking instead whether matter could be conscious in some way, a view broadly known as panpsychism. Indeed, the dividing line between living and non-living is itself surprisingly fuzzy and contested. In any case, even if one could clearly differentiate living and non-living entities, some theorists nevertheless argue the latter can also be conscious. While this may sound radical, consider the view above that consciousness may not suddenly appear at a given point on the evolutionary tree, but emerges by degrees. So as one proceeds down the tree, it fades away into increasingly rudimentary protoforms. But then, if we lack a clear dividing line between living and non-living phenomena, on what basis must we restrict it to the former? Might it not continue in some way even into matter itself? Indeed, the possibility of such panpsychism is taken seriously by some of the most influential philosophers of mind. Related to panpsychism, some theorists have proposed that consciousness may be a physical field extending beyond the brain, as I have recently reviewed and argued for myself. There are two subtly different variants of this idea. The first is that consciousness originates in the brain, but may radiate out in some way. Some theories, for example, suggest electrical brain activity generates an electromagnetic field that is the basis for consciousness, and moreover which, as with other such fields, can extend outwards, thus interacting with matter outside the brain. The second is the even more far-reaching notion that consciousness does not originate in the brain, but exists in some other fashion, with the brain receiving it in some manner, like an antenna picking up radio waves. On this view, consciousness is suffused throughout the universe as an emergent force or property, akin to other forces of nature. Macomb, 2021, for instance, describes the consciousness field as an interconnected, endless, and non-local fifth force of nature, that is, received by the brain and integrated by its electromagnetic field to generate its local consciousness. Relatedly, Meyer and Geysink, 2017, propose the brain is embedded in a holographic structured field that interacts with resonant sensitive structures in the various cell types in our body. It is beyond the scope here to dwell on the intricacies of such theories. The point is they are being given consideration by consciousness scholars and clearly have relevance to the UAP issue, being pertinent, for example, to the kind of views aired by Nolan above. Moreover, at this point, one starts to see mysteries intertwining, with speculations by scholars of physics, consciousness, and UAP converging on fascinating common territory with direct relevance to the interdimensional hypothesis. Perhaps the key question here, uniting these concerns, is what matter is. A common way to conceptualize matter is through related concepts like material and substance, in distinction to phenomena that are in some way immaterial and ontologically subjective, such as mind and consciousness. Oxford Languages, for example, the dictionary used by Google, has for its first entry on matter the definition physical substance in general as distinct from mind and spirit. But if matter itself could be conscious, then such distinctions begin to break down or make less sense. Indeed, as we saw above, these are the kinds of conundrums with which physicists have been wrestling over the past century, as reflected in Jeans's 1937 remark that the universe begins to look more like a great thought than a great machine. Now such questions are similarly beginning to perplex UAP scholars, as per Nolan's speculation about some form of consciousness that is non-material. One way to interpret this remark is the possibility of consciousness arising not only in relation to a conventional material substance, i.e. a human brain, but in other ways that are not understood but nevertheless involve some form of physical matter, even if such terms are now more problematic and mysterious in light of ideas such as panpsychism. Eric Davis, for example, a physicist closely connected to the UAP topic, and indeed to possible crash retrieval and reverse engineering programs, said in an interview on Open Minds UFO Radio 2018 that many UAP craft behave like a conscious psychic entity. Might the strange orbs, which constitute a majority of UAP sightings, for example, be a manifestation of consciousness as a form of matter that appears as a perceptible object in spacetime? Such manifestations could involve anything from the non-local consciousness field crystallizing into a temporary physical form, to conscious entities who usually exist in other dimensions materializing into the four space-time dimensions usually perceived by humans. Clearly, we are far out in speculative territory here. However, it is not out of keeping with ideas found in physics and consciousness studies, as discussed above. Indeed, beyond the issue of UAP per se, some theorists have suggested that all matter is a materialization of consciousness. Rather than matter having ontological primacy, and consciousness emerging from it under special circumstances, for example in a human brain, some have reversed this and view matter instead as an emanation of consciousness. Max Planck, for instance, Nobel Prize-winning originator of quantum theory, said, "I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness." From this radical perspective, orbs and other UAP would be just a special subset of a much broader process of matter, whatever this now means, arising out of consciousness, whatever this also now means. Whatever the ultimate actuality, such are the kinds of possibilities being wrestled with by UAP scholars, from Vallée and Neal to Lukatsky and Nolan. However, as it stands, the significance of consciousness to the topic and the possibility of an interdimensional hypothesis more generally does not appear to be a priority for authorities investigating the phenomenon, as noted above with respect to NASA's task force. Such an omission is problematic, since the contribution of scholars studying subjects like consciousness are needed to fully explore and understand this topic. To that point, the article concludes with a general plea for epistemic openness and humility. Epistemic openness. Above, I have argued that three fundamental forms of strangeness, UAP themselves, the universe, and consciousness, mean an interdimensional hypothesis is at least tenable and cannot simply be dismissed. Finally, augmenting these arguments are some more general considerations, i.e. unrelated to UAP per se, around recognizing the limits to our awareness and understanding of the cosmos. In short, humans, like all animals, tend to be aware only of the small aspect of reality that A, is pertinent to our existence, and B, we have the capacity and the technology to perceive. Essentially, our horizons are limited to our Umwelt, a term coined by German biologist von Uexküll, 1928, to describe the world experienced by a particular organism. This does not merely mean its surrounding environment, for two key reasons. First, only certain aspects of the surroundings are relevant and perceptible to the organism. Second, the organism is not merely passively influenced by its environment, but actively shapes it. Thus, the Umwelt is all aspects of the world that have an effect on the agent, reason 1, and can be affected by the agent, reason 2. Although initially used in ethology to describe animal perception and behavior, more recently the idea has also been extended to humans, such as work on embodied cognition. Crucially, our Umwelt is limited and partial in three main ways: dimensionally, temporally, and spatially. In each, we only access a narrow portion of the relevant bandwidths, certainly vis-a-vis other animals, and even more so in absolute terms, in the context of all possible perceptual stimuli. Of course, technology, from the telescope to the microscope, has expanded our Umwelt. However, even then, our perceptual horizons are still limited in vital ways, even just compared to other animals. Then, more radically, the difference between us and other animals is minuscule compared to the entire scope of Umwelt possibilities. In absolute terms, most animals are very similar in size and longevity. We cannot imagine, for instance, what it might be like to perceive the universe if we were the size of a photon at one extreme or a galaxy at the other. This point has been made by numerous UAP experts, who point out that our understanding of UAP and whatever entities or processes may be responsible for them is constrained by the limits of our perceptual and cognitive horizons. As former CIA officer Jim Semivan put it, there's a whole other reality that surrounds us that we just simply don't have the ability to see or interact with. He further suggested that this veil had enabled ultraterrestrial entities of some kind to remain hidden from us, saying, "There's an entity out there. There's some kind of non-human intelligence that's living with us on this fucking planet." Of course, we cannot help being limited in our perceptual range. However, what we can help, but generally do not, is being aware of these limitations. Instead, we often take our Umwelt for granted as just how things are. This does not mean our understanding is necessarily wrong or our truths are relative. Although humans are liable to misapprehensions and errors, we are capable of registering information about our world that seems not only useful, but also correct in some objective sense. Crucially, though, even such information is highly selective and partial, as if gazing at the night sky through a small window. Our view may be faithful as far as our eyes allow, but not only does the vast majority of the sky lie outside the boundary of the frame, even the visible stars do not exhaust the potential contents of that portion of the sky, for example, with other stars too small and distant, or obscured by light pollution. However, the human tendency is to assume we perceive all there is to perceive. We conflate the Umwelt with the totality of which it is merely a small part. In one sense, this naive realism is integral to the efficacy of science. By rigorously attending only to what can be observed and measured, the scientific enterprise has been undeniably successful. However, the history of science also highlights its limitation, with many advances initially meeting resistance from what Kuhn, 1962, called the dominant paradigm, the current scientific Umwelt, reality as understood by most scientists. Whenever findings emerge that challenge this consensus, such work is initially liable to be rejected, ignored, or possibly dismissed as bad science. If dissenting evidence keeps accumulating, however, a tipping point might be reached, in which the paradigm is viewed as inaccurate or deficient and may be supplanted by a new one in a paradigm shift. For many scholars, the interdimensional hypothesis will likely be firmly outside their Umwelt and contrary to their assumptions of the laws of nature. However, the UAP data may compel us to reconsider and even overturn our existing paradigms, especially as we develop new technologies that expand our Umwelt and understanding of the cosmos, as noted further in the conclusion. Conclusion. This article has discussed a hypothesis for a topic that authorities appear increasingly attentive to, and moreover perplexed by, namely UAP. If these phenomena really cannot be accounted for in terms of human technology or natural conventional phenomena, the first alternative explanation is usually that these constitute extraterrestrial craft. However, many people closest to the topic, from pilots witnessing UAP to scientists analyzing them, are open to even more far-fetched and radical possibilities, ones sometimes interpreted as paranormal and that can broadly be assembled under the label of ultraterrestrial hypothesis, which includes the interdimensional hypothesis as a subset. This is the idea that UAP may represent activities of beings or forms of consciousness that may already be present in the Earth's environment in some sense, just not in ways we can conventionally understand. I suggested that people are turning to such notions due to the sheer strangeness of UAP activity, the universe, and consciousness. The paper then concluded with a plea for epistemic humility and openness, given that our perception and understanding of the universe is still very limited. Indeed, every passing year seems to bring new discoveries that challenge or overturn existing assumptions. As we continue to explore the mysteries of the cosmos, we may find that an interdimensional hypothesis is not so unimaginable after all. Indeed, not only that hypothesis, but a host of other phenomena under the broad banner of the paranormal that overlap with the UAP topic, from psychokinesis to remote viewing. Although these tend to be dismissed by most scientists, a wealth of data collected over the decades appears to suggest these may be genuine phenomena, or at least are not easily dismissed. While skepticism regarding such phenomena is surely still warranted, such analyses mean we cannot simply dismiss these possibilities out of hand, and must at least investigate further. This article has made the case for epistemic humility and scientific openness towards the interdimensional hypothesis specifically, but this curiosity should be extended to the gamut of potentially extraordinary phenomena. As Einstein said, it is entirely possible that behind the perception of our senses, worlds are hidden of which we are unaware. That concludes the reading of the Ultraterrestrial Hypothesis by Tim Lomas. Within a week or two, I'll be reading the Cryptoterrestrial Hypothesis, a case for scientific openness to a concealed earthly explanation for UAP by Tim Lomas, Michael Masters, and Brendan Case. Following that will be episode 13, the Ultraterrestrial/Cryptoterrestrial Hypothesis. Take care, everyone, and I'll see you next time.